truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
Tuesday, August 13th, 2024, the 1,301st day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. Today with a bit of an appetizer. This is Stephen Colbert's Late Show, the CBS late night show that he took over from David Letterman. And his guest is CNN's Caitlin Collins.
Trump has kind of been thrown on his heels by this, and he's not really sure how to go after Vice President Harris. He knew his attack lines on President Biden. He really has struggled with how to go after someone who's 20 years younger than him, who is a different gender, a different race. It's kind of been this moment where he has not been able to coalesce around a single attack line.
I know you guys are objective over there, that you just report the news as it is. No, I know. CNN makes a... I know
Was that supposed to be a laugh line?
I wasn't supposed to be, but I guess it is.
So that's where we are. We've reached the point where it's now just automatically funny to pretend that the cable news is objective. And it seems to me like they were trying to be serious. CNN is marketed as the straight down the middle network. It's not MSNBC. It's not Fox News. They're the objective cable network between those two other biased networks. And even Stephen Colbert's totally detached audience of standard issue villagers understands how absurd that is. And so with that in mind, let's talk about the big media event of last night. And that was Donald Trump joining in for a Spaces conversation on X, formerly Twitter, with the quote-unquote owner of X, Elon Musk. The two of them sat down and talked for about 2.5 hours. That began only after a long delay due to what was called a distributed denial of service attack, a DDoS attack, that I suppose we should take to mean that entrance into that X space was flooded, very likely with Twitter bots, because I don't think that access to the X space was even possible without an account. I tried to go in directly through the link. It did not work. So my assumption is that as soon as the space opened up, and it was Donald Trump hosting the space, all sorts of bot accounts, a bot army, if you will, flooded into the space, preventing other people from joining and ultimately shutting down the space. Elon Musk posted about 18 minutes into the problem after the show was supposed to start. He said there appears to be a massive DDoS attack on X, working on shutting it down. Worst case, we will proceed with a smaller number of live listeners and post the conversation later. And it was interesting throughout that time, we had one portal open and accessible that we were using as our feed to stream through Badlands Media. I think War Room had theirs active as well. And besides that, people were having a really hard time being able to access the Twitter space. Now, this could be a coincidence and be largely disconnected, but there was also a push on that platform and others yesterday, a hashtag campaign for a Twitter blackout. People were going to show how opposed to all this they were by logging off Twitter or maybe deleting their accounts. And so I have to wonder if there was some sort of coordinated bot activity and an expected response that might mean certain accounts would disappear. So I'll be keeping my eyes and ears open over the course of the next few days to see if anything like that emerges. But they finally got started with the conversation. They had over 1 million people in that X space for pretty much the entire time. It seemed like it hovered around 1.2 to 1.3 million live listeners for the bulk of the conversation. Elon Musk made it clear that what he wanted to do was sit down and have a conversation. He didn't want it to be an interview. The media is very upset that he did not spend his time fact-checking Donald Trump. They just talked, and Elon allowed Donald Trump to talk for as long as he felt like talking about a great many subjects. He let him say whatever he wanted to say. And of course, the media responded today by letting us know how unprofessional that is. It's supposed to be exciting and on point and always interesting. You're not just supposed to treat the president like he's a person and allow him to speak and say the things that he wants to say. You're supposed to guide him into saying the things that you want him to say. They started off talking about the Trump assassination event, and Trump had quite a bit to say about that. He was mostly lighthearted throughout the conversation. He was even funny at times. He seems to be in good spirits about the whole thing. He does not seem to want to go after the Secret Service, though he did make it clear that that sort of thing just can't happen. The entire situation is still extraordinarily weird. Every day there is some news story about Thomas Matthew Crooks with his weird little face as the picture for that story. Some new details that add on to the series of other details, but do absolutely nothing to suggest that an answer to what has happened has been found. or that another assassination event will be prevented in the future. Trump mentioned many times, and Elon Musk agreed, that it was clear Joe Biden and Kamala Harris could never sit down for a conversation like that. We've talked about the reasons why numerous times, to keep their stories intact, to protect any remaining connection between the central narrative and reality prime, any discernible reality. They really do need to have full command of the official story and what it means and what they're able to say about it at all times. And with the number, complexity, and scale of the lies at this point, pretty much no one is able to do that, especially not if the person they're in conversation with is adversarial in any way, or wants to ask follow-up questions, or disagree with something, or ask them about the underlying purpose or morality of whatever it is they're advocating. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris can't do that. No one on that side can do that, because the justifications for what they want to do are the sorts of things that would make Americans recoil and reject all of these people. So they keep the lies going. But the lies aren't flexible. They're not able to adjust their stories to the context of any given conversation. So they could never sit down for 3 hours live in an open format and talk about a range of issues. There are certainly people that don't like Donald Trump, and many of them don't like how Donald Trump speaks. They think that Donald Trump sounds stupid and like he doesn't know what he's talking about because he doesn't have that polished delivery that you might find from a character like Barack Obama or Pete Buttigieg. And there are probably examples of straight men like that, too. For some reason, this strange brand of faux elitism that we practice in mainstream popular American culture, Kamala Harris, with her vocal fry and up-talking and cackling, is meant to sound authentic and educated, whereas Donald Trump is portrayed as though he sounds like some kind of poor laborer who never completed elementary school, even though one of these people excelled in his university education and then became a billionaire real estate mogul, one of the world's most recognizable celebrities who's created a billion-dollar brand beyond his actual businesses, has starred in hit television shows and became president by defeating every American political dynasty that stood in his way, and the other one failed her bar exam and got her career in politics by doing sexual favors for Willie Brown. They pretend that Donald Trump is stupid while he has full command over an entire range of subjects, regardless of whether or not he always says the perfect thing or whether his answers trigger the people who hate him and are triggered by everything he does. Whereas Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and the rest of them for that matter, can't speak in an informed or interesting way about any of these issues. Could you imagine Joe Biden or Kamala Harris talking about the future of nuclear energy? It's ridiculous. And that, of course, is why they're focused on talking about a range of issues that have nothing to do with the substance of the conversation. They're trying to portray the conversation as a disaster in hopes that no one will listen to it. That doesn't often work. This morning, an account on X, formerly Twitter, called Autism Capital, wrote, "Collection of negative headlines from the Trump and Elon spaces." And here are some of the headlines. From USA Today: Trump rambles, slurs his way through Elon Musk interview. It was an unmitigated disaster. Fox News: Kamala Harris's campaign criticizes Trump for serving self-obsessed rich guys after interview with Elon Musk. Does that sound like what Trump is doing? Donald Trump's lisp during Elon Musk interview raises questions. Yes, it raises the question, how is it possible that people who consider themselves to be informed journalists think that Donald Trump just developed a lisp out of nowhere based on how his voice sounded compressed through his phone conversation and then broadcast out on the Spaces app? That's not even something unusual. It happens regularly. And of course, there's also video of Trump from Mar-a-Lago while he was speaking on Spaces with Elon Musk, and it's quite clear there's no lisp. It is ridiculous. The Guardian said, so Donald chatted with Elon, and here's the future as they see it. Losers win, incompetence rules. New York Times, Musk's Trump talk on X. After glitchy start, a 2-hour ramble. The Guardian with another article, the Trump-Musk interview. A surprisingly dull meeting of two planet-sized egos. The Guardian again, familiar vitriol and Musk the enabler. Key takeaways from Trump's X interview. Wired. Donald Trump and Elon Musk's X conversation took forever to start, then never ended. And it just goes on and on. There's like 30 or 40 of these. The Independent. Trump repeats same old talking points in Musk interview, but lisp steals show. So a fake lisp stole the show? Really? The New York Times. Donald Trump regales Elon Musk with familiar falsehoods. Financial Times. Donald Trump and Elon Musk, a tale of two struggling social media entrepreneurs. How are either of them struggling? The New York Times worried that Elon Musk is using X to push his views. Oh, wait a second. He's using the thing that he, quote unquote, owns in whatever way he wants. And the people who owned it before him were using it in a different way because obviously we didn't hear this complaint back then. So what way were they using it? Were they using it in the way that they wanted? So they were doing the exact same thing, but now it's a problem because they don't agree with Elon Musk. Oh, that's right. Got it. Another article from The Guardian. Donald Trump rambles and lies repeatedly in interview with Elon Musk, and The Atlantic had a great one. Elon Musk throws a Trump rally. That was a public tantrum thrown by The Atlantic's Charlie Wartzel, another wannabe elite at The Atlantic. He was the man who wrote the article for the New York Times back in early 2021 with the headline, "Don't Go Down the Rabbit Hole. Critical thinking as we're taught to do it isn't helping in the fight against misinformation." Basically, don't do your own research because you might come to the wrong conclusions. At least it's nice to know that they still care about us. Now, during the conversation, in the middle of the conversation, the quote unquote Harris Walls campaign put out this statement. Right now, Elon Musk is interviewing Donald Trump live on Twitter. We're not calling it X, they say in parentheses. Oh, how bold. It's not enough that Musk has pledged to donate millions of dollars to help re-elect Trump. He's using his purchased platform, one of the largest social media sites in the world, to spread Trump's unhinged and hateful agenda to millions of users. If that's all you need to hear, chip in $25 now to help Kamala and Tim have the resources to respond to their lies. Otherwise, let us remind you why this is a big deal. The richest person in the world is a lackey for Team MAGA. Musk already ruined Twitter by allowing hate speech and disinformation to flood the platform. Now Musk is using his vast fortune and broad reach to try to control our democracy. Later, as things wound down, the quote-unquote Harris Walls campaign followed up with another statement. Donald Trump's extremism and dangerous Project 2025 agenda is a feature, not a glitch of his campaign, which was on full display for those unlucky enough to listen in tonight during whatever that was on X.com. Trump's entire campaign is in service of people like Elon Musk and himself, self-obsessed rich guys who will sell out the middle class and who cannot run a live stream in the year 2024. Ah, yes, that was the problem. They were unable to run the live stream. It was not the fact that the platform was relentlessly attacked by a bot army for about 45 minutes. It was that President Trump and all the people around him and the great tech genius of our age, they were unable to run a live stream. Also, isn't it weird? And oh boy, I do mean weird. Not like weird horse stuff, just weird, normal weird. that they keep trying to pretend that Project 2025 is somehow the Donald Trump agenda. He has disavowed Project 2025 numerous times. That's the mainstream conservative establishment agenda. As I mentioned yesterday, Trump just put out that video directing people to the 20 core principles and promises of Donald Trump's 2024 Make America Great Again agenda. It's not confusing. He's got virtually nothing to do with Project 2025. They tie him to it because members of his first administration and people who are still kind of roughly in his orbit contributed a few ideas to Project 2025. It's kind of incredible to me they even think they can pull this off. Elon eventually reposted that post from Autism Capital and said a wall of negative headlines was so predictable. They're such NPCs, and that refers to non-player characters if you're not familiar with that acronym. It's a reference to video game characters who are essentially just part of the game's environment. Like if you were playing a video game, you're the main character, you're walking around a city street. The NPCs would be the renderings of other characters walking around the city streets, making it feel like you're in an active and bustling city. Elon continued, all this does is drive even more people to listen to the conversation themselves and realize how much the legacy media lies to them. And hopefully people will realize that. And hopefully the fact that it sustained a long DDoS attack should tell them that people did not want the public at large to hear from Donald Trump and Elon Musk in this extended form on that particular platform, the platform that for so long was the key information weapon for the global regime. That was their Death Star. Over 1 million people at a time listening live got to hear Donald Trump say a whole litany of counter-narrative things for 2.5 hours. He talked about how Joe Biden was taken out through a Democrat coup. And I don't know that we will take the time for this, but David Remnick of The New Yorker interviewed Nancy Pelosi, and she went through chapter and verse of how they helped move Joe Biden along into the sunset. Biden is apparently slated to speak, in quotes, I guess you can call it speaking, at the Democrat National Convention next week. Hillary Clinton is supposed to speak, as well as Michelle Obama and his husband Barack Hussein Obama. The satire site Babylon Bee today published a great headline that read, Insane conspiracy theorist thinks Biden's still alive. And yeah, it's a little strange that this so-called president just disappears from public view for a month in the middle of what we are told is a presidential campaign. Now, Biden being dead used to be one of those things that information gatekeepers would get all upset about, and they'd say, talking about that is going to make us look stupid. It's a black hat op to make us look dumb in front of people who wore 2 masks. But I guess now it's okay for normies to joke about it if Babylon Bee is writing headlines. A lot of people focused in on how Trump and Musk talked about a government efficiency commission that Elon Musk might serve on, trying to figure out what parts of the federal government can just be cut. Here's a hint. It's basically all of them. Sign me up. I will gladly be on that commission. I'll come in for about 10 minutes and say, yep, it's all of them. Come get me if you need me. I'll be in the break room. I expect our work will be concluded by the end of today. Trump talked about energy independence and energy dominance. He talked about how much energy we would need based on what AI would require. That always makes me think he must be referring to the energy consumption of Bitcoin. They talked about nuclear energy. Elon Musk noting that Fukushima actually didn't present the massive worldwide environmental catastrophe we were led to believe. He talked about how it was important not to demonize the fossil fuel industry and how it was important to understand that nuclear energy was a lot safer than people have been led to believe. Trump talked about nuclear warming, framed as a race in nuclear proliferation, as if this was the Cold War, but again, seeming to layer more accurately onto an understanding of nuclear energy for that Bitcoin process in this new potential parallel energy comms finance national security infrastructure that is being built up with Elon Musk's portfolio of companies, as he is the biggest Defense Department contractor. He talked about the possibility that China could eventually surpass us. He talked about some of these other world leaders who seem to have taken on the mission of opposing the global regime. As we have discussed many times, they are often framed as autocrats and strong men and brutal dictators. Trump talked about Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un and how important it was to get along with these people, to have good, friendly relations with them, regardless of our status as rivals or adversaries or whatever it might be. And they discussed how preposterous it is to consider Joe Biden or Kamala Harris actually having to go head to head with those men. And of course, that scenario would be just for show anyway, because they're puppets, they're Manchurian candidates. They don't actually make decisions. They exist for photo ops. They exist to create the illusion of diplomacy, that they're representing the people's interests abroad, when all they're doing is co-opting the people's stamp of approval and adding it to whatever the global regime has decided will happen. Musk finished the conversation with a strong endorsement of Donald Trump, saying, "I think we're at a fork in the road of civilization, and I think we need to choose the right path, and I think you're the right path." The official X, formerly Twitter, account on X, formerly Twitter, posted late last night, between 7:47 p.m. and 10:47 p.m. Eastern, President Donald Trump's space post received 73 million views. During the same period, there were 4 million posts about Elon Musk and President Trump's conversation on X, generating a total of 998 million views. Musk responded saying, "Combined views of the conversation with Donald Trump and subsequent discussion by other accounts now around 1 billion. So that's a whole lot of eyes. That's not a suggestion that a billion people tuned in to listen to the conversation, but it does indicate that that was the main topic of conversation for a substantial time. Could Kamala Harris draw numbers like that? Of course not. Joe Biden? Never. Hillary Clinton? Michelle Obama? Let's find out. But no amount of commandeered pop concerts, AI-generated crowds, and strange horse stuff from the fake vice president's fake vice president is going to make anything the Democrats do seem more popular than anything Donald Trump does. They are attempting to create the illusion of popularity, and they are failing spectacularly. And whenever they begin to convince people that they actually might have some popularity, Donald Trump does just about anything and immediately shuts down that whole idea. Trump posted this morning on Truth Social saying, "I spent 2.5 hours last night talking to Elon Musk, a fantastic guy, getting all-time record views and hits. And all the fake news wants to report is that the servers crashed because of the tremendous volume. And the show opened a little late. What they should be reporting was the incredible number of people that were listening. I absolutely hate the fake news media. So bad for our country." Now, of course, people like me wanted to hear Donald Trump talk about a whole range of subjects that really were not discussed last night. And that's fine. These events aren't for me. They're not for you. This is messaging aimed at the general public. Elon Musk talked about how he's been a moderate Democrat for his whole life, and he understands that the only choice is Trump. Apparently, this was one of those waking up the normies events, and I hope that it does exactly that. But again, the 2020 election is unresolved. Donald Trump never conceded. This is a fake campaign leading up to what must be at this point a fake election. And so what we have is ultimately a battle of narratives, as I have said many times. If the election is fake, it's only a battle of narratives. It's about the court of public opinion, about the people deciding what they want and about what they're prepared to believe, and how much they are willing to participate in the incentive and punishment structure before they will stand up, be honest, and opt out. And likewise, if the election is real and 100% legitimate, it is still just a battle of narratives, and the results of the election will reflect the winner of that battle of narratives. All of the actual arguments have already been won. It is a game of perceptions and whether or not the uniparty is able to create the image of popularity for any of its candidates. Because winning this battle of narratives the way that it must be won, the way that it will be won, is going to reverberate throughout the entire country at all levels of our politics. It's not going to be possible for the Drag Queen Story Hour school board members to convince the public in their community that they won an election if everyone participating in that election, voting in their race, ties that person to Kamala Harris, to Joe Biden, to this uniparty movement. And that'll apply just the same to all the rhinos throughout the country who have refused to stand with Donald Trump. I've said many times, I think there's going to be one moment where the nation finally accepts that our elections are stolen. It hits that critical mass. We've been well over 50% for this entire time. There was polling in mid-2021 that suggested upwards of 60%. Around 2/3 of the country understood that our election outcomes were affected by cheating, by manipulation, by fraud and theft. And eventually that dam is just going to break, and then it will be common knowledge that our elections are stolen, that they are unreliable, that they are incapable of producing a legitimate result. And we've been discussing how we're drawing ever closer to that moment. It advanced again yesterday. This is from Politico from Monday afternoon, August 12th. The nation's best hackers found vulnerabilities in voting machines, but no time to fix them. Some of the best hackers in the world gathered in Las Vegas over the weekend to try to break into voting machines that will be used in this year's election, all with an eye to helping officials identify and fix vulnerabilities. The problem? Their findings will likely come too late to make any fixes before November 5th. Well, shucks. So they hired all of these hackers to come in and test out the voting machines and see if there was anything wrong with them. It turns out there's a few things wrong, but there's just no time to fix them. You see, there's only 85 days between now and that election, and we just found out about these problems. Can you believe it? Politico is telling the country we've just found out about these problems. Of course, we didn't find out about these problems. All of these problems have arisen many times in the past, including at these conferences. These conferences were depicted in HBO's documentary film Kill Chain that describes the machine vulnerabilities in our elections and features many prominent Democrats, including one Kamala Harris, clearly understanding that the machines were wide open and vulnerable to manipulation. Politico continues, in one sense, it's the normal course of events. Every August, hackers at the DEF CON conference find security gaps in voting equipment, and every year the long and complex process of fixing them means nothing is implemented until the next electoral cycle. But Election Day security is under particular scrutiny in 2024. That's both because of increasing worries that foreign adversaries will figure out how to breach machines and because President Donald Trump's unsubstantiated allegations of widespread fraud in 2020 undermined confidence in the vote among his supporters. Actually, they've undermined confidence in the vote among everybody. That's because nobody should have any confidence in our elections. If you have confidence that our elections can produce a legitimate result, you are deluding yourself and making it more difficult to actually achieve some workable solution. As a result, many in the election security community are bemoaning the fact that no system has been developed to roll out fixes faster and worrying that the security gaps that get identified this year will provide fodder for those who may want to question the results. Exactly. They should provide fodder for that. No one should accept the results of this election unless they are made fully transparent, fully verifiable, and are, in fact, verified through forensic audits of whatever depth is required to convince Americans that the elections were free and fair, safe and secure, and that the reported results accurately reflect the will and intent of the voters, no matter who the television says is the winner. That's a perfectly effective option for our side. I'm not the least bit concerned that we won't win elections in a dominating landslide fashion at every level of government all across the nation. I am not the least bit concerned about our chances for success in a free and fair election. So we should want them just for that reason alone, even if all we're after is our own benefit. But we should also want that level of transparency and verifiability for the good of the country. We should want it for our opponent's benefit as well. Because even if we win in landslide fashion and the TV says we have won in landslide fashion, we would still be in this state of instability until the losers in those elections were able to verify the results as well. That's something that we should want no matter what side we're on, no matter what political positions we support now and into the future. If we are still to have elections in the future, this is going to be necessary. And in addition to it being to our benefit and their benefit, this is also the only way to heal that divide. So you really have to wonder about the people who are opposed to this approach. Are they looking to just be declared the winners so that they can seize power and then keep this thoroughly corrupted system in place to use for their own benefit? I wouldn't want to align myself with that sort of power. I don't think Donald Trump would either. I sure hope he wouldn't. And if he does, we should be very concerned. But let's continue with Politico. As far as the time goes, it's hard to make any real major systemic changes, but especially 90 days out from the election, said Catherine Terranova, one of the organizers of the DEF CON Voting Village hacking event. She's argued that's particularly troubling during, quote, an election year like this. From Friday to Sunday, Voting Village hackers clustered around tables with all shapes and sizes of voting machines and equipment to verify voters' identities or tabulate ballots, trying to get past firewalls or other security measures. Nearby, secretaries of state and other election officials gave talks on misinformation and disinformation threats facing the upcoming election. Isn't that amazing? In the same room where the voting machines they use to run their elections are being shown to be incapable of producing legitimate election results, the secretaries of state put in their positions through stolen elections are publicly fretting about problems of misinformation and disinformation. They're not concerned about the election results being unbelievable. They're concerned about people not being willing to believe them despite that. Unlike most other events at the conference, though, the Voting Village was not on the main show floor. It was a decision organizers said was necessary in order to ensure security following years of hatred flung at the event online by those who see the hackers as undermining democracy. In recent years, individuals associated with election denialism showed up at the Voting Village to harass organizers and speakers. You see that? They have to try to hide in the shadows because they're worried about online hatred. They're worried about election denialism just because their machines don't work. The findings, at times ignored or resisted by the manufacturers of voting machines, have increasingly been accepted in Washington, and the event is often seen as key for boosting the security of machines. It's like the perfect limited hangout operation. They let you know that the machines have flaws and can be accessed and manipulated, but only because these are the world's best hackers, and thank goodness they've found out in advance. Therefore, when we tell you that the machines are just fine when the election comes around, you'll believe it, even though they've done absolutely nothing. And just like every year since the Voting Village began almost a decade ago, attendees found problems. Organizers of the Voting Village intend to put out a full report in the coming weeks detailing the vulnerability findings from this cycle. And according to Voting Village co-founder Harry Hursty, these vulnerabilities ran multiple pages as of Saturday afternoon. While Hursty would not comment on the exact problems found, the amount was fairly consistent with previous years. Those discoveries come amid ongoing foreign and criminal targeting of U.S. elections. In 2016, Russian hackers targeted the campaign of Democrat presidential candidate Hillary Clinton and compromised voter registration databases in multiple U.S. states. It's affecting this election cycle already, as Politico first reported Saturday that the presidential campaign of former President Donald Trump was hacked. a breach the campaign attributed to Iran. Actually, no. The campaign said that Microsoft said it was Iran. The campaign didn't attribute it to anyone. While there have been no foreign cyber attacks taking wide swaths of voting machines offline on Election Day or evidence of hacks that affected results, the risk is always there. And how about that? They choose two options of things that could happen, say those two things didn't happen, and then allow the reader to assume that because those things hadn't happened, the election results from the machines to this point must be just fine. We've discussed many times that the hacks are not the only vulnerabilities here. If you don't think this kind of place is running 24/7 in China, Russia, you're kidding yourselves, Hursty said, gesturing around the room of voting equipment. We are here only for 2.5 days and we find stuff. It would be stupid to assume that the adversaries don't have absolute access to everything. Any issues found in these machines, most of which are used in at least one jurisdiction around the U.S., would need to go through a complex process to be fixed, and that takes much longer than the 2 months until the November general election. And yeah, they've only known about these problems for a decade, so 2.5 months isn't long enough to fix them. But after that 2.5 months, then we'll have a new election. And then since no one can challenge that election without being an election denier and telling the big lie and threatening our democracy and maybe subjecting themselves to imprisonment, we'll just have to wait to have this conversation until the next one of these things that will come right before another election without enough time to fix it in time for that election. So when we are approaching a future election, it's too close to that election to make any changes, unless it's for COVID, of course. And then after that election, if you want to make changes, then you're threatening our democracy. That's how these massive problems with voting machines can just survive year after year after year for a decade, 2 decades. It's just never the right time. Either there's not enough time or it's too dangerous to even think about discussing the problem. Voting Village organizers are frustrated that despite years of security findings, voting machine vendors aren't moving more quickly to make fixes. There's so much basic stuff that should be happening, and it is not happening. So yes, I'm worried about things not being fixed, but they haven't been fixed for a long time, and I'm also angry about it, Hursty said during a break in the day. While there is a robust system in place for certifying voting systems, it's a long one, and they also don't actually do it. Even if you find a vulnerability next week in a piece of modern equipment that's deployed in the field, there's a challenge in getting the patch and getting the fix out to the state and local election officials and onto the equipment before the November election, said Scott Algier, executive director of the Information Technology, Information Sharing, and Analysis Center. The group serves as a way for companies in the IT space to share threat information. So he's suggesting, this IT guy is suggesting that it's impossible to implement a patch in a computer system in only 85 days, even though you can probably do something like that in a matter of minutes. And of course, all of this ignores the fact that all these machines are actually required to do is add 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. But of course, that's not all we have them do. We have them handle our entire election. Because the population is just so big. If we did the old style of election, it would take too long. I mean, back then we used to get results on election night. Now we don't get them for weeks. Sometimes they remain in dispute for months and years without any certain verifiable outcome. But hey, the system's not perfect. And of course, it's not more efficient. It's not more cost effective. In fact, there is big money to be made just on the bribes related to the sales of election equipment, as we saw with the Smartmatic indictments last week. It's not like that same situation doesn't exist in states all across our country. But hey, I'm not an IT expert. What do I know? Let's find out from the experts. Algier, who also runs the organization's Elections Industry Special Interest Group, said the process involves getting sign-off from the machine manufacturer, then getting the system recertified by relevant authorities, then going in and updating each device. This complex series of steps is complicated even more by most election machines being locked down weeks in advance of the elections. And let's pause just a second to review those steps. Getting sign-off from the machine manufacturers, who are in public-private partnership agreements with the states. They function as an agent of the state, but they also retain full ownership of their intellectual property, and the state has no access to any of that. So the machine manufacturer needs to agree once more that they will fix the problems with the machines. They get to tell the states, no, I don't think we're going to do that. Then they need to get the system recertified by the relevant authorities. And man, that means that they've got to work through the bureaucracy to get things scheduled and have those bureaucrats appear in the right place at the right time so that they can run that program just to make sure everything's okay. And nobody has time for that, not when it comes to our elections. And then they've got to update the devices, and that could take minutes. And all of that is complicated by the fact that the states lock down their election machines weeks before the elections ever start. So whoops, I guess we've created a system with all of these vulnerabilities that make it impossible to ensure a legitimate election can even be held. And we've also created a system that makes it impossible to fix. Whoops. Algiers says it's not a 90-day fix. It's not a Microsoft every Tuesday issue your patch and everything works fine. It's a pretty complicated process. Sure it is. There are some proposals to speed up the process so election officials aren't scrambling to update voting machines every time DEF CON happens in an election year. For example, some argue that depending too much on one annual event at a private conference is not the best approach. One option to speed up the process? Bring voting machine vendors together with hackers in a more formalized setting. The election industry SIG hosted an event last year in Washington that did just that and helped build bridges between typically suspicious industry and security researchers. We want to build a program where we can work in partnership with the security researchers under the principles of coordinated vulnerability disclosure, Algiers said. Until then, for those who packed the voting village this weekend with lines spilling out in the hallway, the event serves a higher purpose. We may not be able to fix everything about our election system in the next 90 days, but we can start by getting some of our facts straight and by understanding how our election systems work, Terra Nova said. So you see that? It's just a mis- and disinformation problem in the end. The machines suck, and we can't fix them. But we want to let everybody know that there are good reasons we can't fix them. And all those reasons, for sure, are our fault. We set up a system to make sure that the machines couldn't be fixed. But it's important for you to understand that it's not that we want rigged elections, and it's not that we don't want to fix the machines. It's just that we can't fix them. So we've admitted it. We've asked for just a bit of grace from everybody. And if you're unwilling to accept us, warts and all, well, then we're going to have to throw you in prison. Sorry. President Hillary Clinton and Vice President Michael Robinson Obama say the election was free and fair. Now, we've been talking consistently about the situation in Venezuela over the last few weeks, and we've spent a big chunk of podcast time this year talking about geopolitics and elections around the world, with the understanding that the same playbook, more or less, plays out over and over again in cyclical fashion in country after country after country, in this cycle of domination through infiltration and destabilization. Through corruption, compromise, and coercion, the global regime gets a foothold in a nation. Then they bring in a flood of money from global donors and investors to enrich those people in that country who are assisting in the implementation of the global regime's agenda for that country. And then eventually things go too far. The people of the country push back. And in some cases, they actually push the global regime out of their country. And then at that point, the global regime begins waging economic warfare through boycotts, sanctions, currency manipulation, restrictions on various industries and trading partners. And then if that doesn't work, they use international military forces, whether it's a UN peacekeeping mission or NATO, or if it goes far enough, they will propagandize their way into creating the pretense for a major war involving the United States of America. This process plays out over and over again. And throughout that process, they try to legitimize their foothold in any given country through their control over the means of information, their domination of the airwaves, and mass propaganda campaigns, complemented by censorship to whatever degree they're able. And so I made it a point this year to spend some time focusing on how things are going in other countries so that we can learn about how things might go here. And we've talked at length about how Venezuela provides a number of templates and predicates and some previews about how things might go. And so over the weekend, it was suggested to me and to the rest of my Badlands cohort by Ash in America that we read through the Smartmatic indictment. And so, of course, I did that, but I was looking for more than just the Smartmatic indictment and stumbled upon a report from a think tank called the International Crisis Group. And before we get into this report, I want to share some of the people supporting the International Crisis Group. These people and organizations are listed at the bottom of the report. These companies are all part of the International Advisory Council. Chevron, HSBC, MetLife, Noble Energy, Shell, and there's a list of individuals as well. On the President's Council, their corporate partners include the energy company BP, and individuals on the President's Council include Scott Bessent, who has recently sounded the warning on what the globalists are attempting to do, and none other than Alexander Soros. On the International Crisis Group's Board of Trustees, we find names like Thomas Pickering, Robert Malley, Wendy Sherman, Alexander and George Soros, the current National Security Advisor to the fake President Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, Larry Summers, Alexander Downer, the Australian spy involved in the Russiagate scandal, having met with George Papadopoulos, and finally, not that this is a comprehensive list, but Mark Malloch Brown, who is the president of the Open Society Foundations, the former UN Deputy Secretary General, and he's the chairman of the board of the holding company that owns Smartmatic, the voting machine company. This report is the playbook for taking over nations. The report describes the current status of their negotiations to get Nicolas Maduro to step down as president of Venezuela and allow the global regime to hold quote-unquote elections under terms that will benefit Maduro's opposition. And this document really is remarkable. We spent some time with it on Saturday night on Devolution Power Hour on Badlands Media. So I hope this won't be too repetitive if you have already watched or listened to that episode. But I think that this is just a perfect illustration of so much of what we've been talking about over the past few years when it comes to that good twin, evil twin dynamic, and when it comes to the real push and pull being between the global regime and the forces for sovereignty in any given country. You can see it here on full display. The authors of the report position themselves as somehow objective. They talk about the Maduro government and the opposition. The opposition are the figures they've chosen to take over running Venezuela. They think that they can negotiate Maduro into standing down and stepping down. They're actually signaling right now that they intend to wait into 2025, expecting Maduro to step down at the end of his current term. And of course, that's ridiculous. This report is from March 11th, 2020, which is the same week that the very deadly pandemic locked down the world. Important to keep that in mind. So I want to go through the executive summary here and then some notes throughout the report. And I hope by that point, it's easy to see what the real negotiations here are. And keep in mind, their partner in this negotiation, Maduro, is obstinate. He's not going to say yes no matter what terms they propose. And they essentially know that. So what they are discussing is how bad they're able to make things for Maduro, which means for the people of Venezuela, until they have some sort of uprising and get rid of Maduro on their own. And you do not need to be a fan of Maduro to understand that George Soros, Alexander Soros, Mark Moloch Brown, and a bunch of other globalists, in conjunction with global energy companies who want access to Venezuelan oil, figuring out ways to overthrow the government, they're not the good guys. Nicolas Maduro is a socialist dictator, they say, and now he's graduated to a communist dictator, but apparently he is somehow still hated by the Soroses and the man who owns the voting machine company. Principal findings from the report. What's new? Talks to resolve Venezuela's political crisis broke down in September, and January's government takeover of parliament dims prospects of their resumption. While the outlines of a possible agreement are visible, the government's unwillingness to compromise and the opposition's lack of realism have, so far, put a solution out of reach. Why does it matter? The country is mired in political conflict and continues to suffer from hyperinflation, high levels of criminal violence, crumbling public services, severe poverty, and malnutrition. Millions have emigrated, provoking a regional refugee crisis. What should be done? Outside parties with ties to either side should put forward a possible settlement, including measures to ensure a level playing field ahead of 2020 parliamentary polls and, later, a presidential election, together with the gradual lifting of U.S. sanctions, and press both to accept it as a basis for negotiations. And again, understand that the two parties here that they're attempting to work out a compromise between are the opposition they've set up, so essentially them, and the people actually in control of the country, in this case, Maduro, the government, and the military, who are not going to say yes under any terms. And of course, I'm obviously not just making that up. This report is 4.5 years old, and you can see what's happening right now. But this is also great for some background. Here's the executive summary. Since January 2019, Venezuela has had two competing presidencies and two starkly different views on how its political struggle should be resolved. What? Two competing presidencies? But how? And that's weird. Maduro still seems to be the only president. What does the other president do? Does he just pretend to be president as he's palling around with globalists? Yes. It has also had one principal victim, a population exposed to a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Over a year on, neither side has achieved its goals. President Nicolas Maduro remains in power. Crippling sanctions are still in place, and a solution hovers well out of sight. With the government feeling more confident, as shown by its 5 January seizure of the National Assembly, and the opposition harboring unrealistic ambitions of swift regime change, outside parties should consider stepping up their involvement, presenting a settlement that restores fair political competition, triggers an early presidential election, and incrementally lifts sanctions, and press their respective allies within the country to accept it as a basis for negotiations. So they're trying to leverage outside influence and outside money to force Venezuela's government to agree to early elections under their terms in order to get these people to lift sanctions and stop waging economic warfare against the people of Venezuela. At first glance, the gap between the two sides appears unbridgeable. De facto power and control of almost all the country's institutions are in the hands of Maduro, whose claim to legitimacy is based on a controversial re-election in May 2018, regarded by the opposition and its international allies as a sham perpetrated by a criminal dictator. So the global regime and the quote-unquote opposition in Venezuela, the opposition to Maduro, call the election held 2 years prior a sham. And because of that, they get to pretend that the opposition actually has the legitimate president, despite controlling essentially none of the country's institutions. So we are dealing with people, including in our own American Uniparty, the American faction of the global regime. They tell us the same thing. They're telling us that someone is president in a country where that person is not president and does not control the institutions of that country as president. They have no problem expressing that to us as a fact about reality prime when it is no such thing. These are the people who tell us that Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes. Let's continue. The opposition, led by Juan Guaido, who is recognized as acting president by 59 countries, insists that an early, credible presidential election be held under international observation and demands that Maduro step down before then. But what the opposition sees as the restoration of democracy, the government regards as a foreign-backed coup. It is adamant that the opposition wishes to erase Chavismo from the political scene and is using outside, mainly U.S., support to ensure that the movement created by late President Hugo Chavez, which has ruled Venezuela for 21 years, cannot stage a comeback. And so Chavismo is basically the parallel in this situation to Trump and Trumpism. Even once the candidate is gone, the ideology still presents a problem for these people. Efforts to reach a peaceful resolution have so far proved fitful and largely fruitless. Several rounds of negotiations have taken place since 2014, but were all marred by mutual suspicion, with the opposition convinced that the government misled it. And I have to say, and I hope you'll agree after we get through all this, that sounds like a framing where these sorts of people told one another and told investors and told donors that they had extracted concessions from the Maduro government that never actually materialized. They're making it seem as though there was some arrangement or agreement. I see no reason to believe that there was ever any of that. Over the last year, both camps have flirted with a negotiated solution, but have also banked on gaining the upper hand over their rival through the passage of time and the assistance of powerful foreign allies. The opposition felt that tightening sanctions and the government's increased international isolation would trigger a rupture within Chavista ranks, notably among the military, or alternatively, that the U.S. might forcefully step in. The government hoped that the longer it resisted sanctions with the help of Russia, China, and others, the more opposition credibility and unity would erode, the more public support for the opposition would dissipate, and the more Guaido's external allies would lose interest. And again, you can play that in parallel. They think that Trumpism will go away. Trumpism's not going anywhere. Time has been particularly unkind to the opposition. Despite earlier hints of U.S. military intervention and an abortive military uprising on 30 April, as well as ever more draconian sanctions and a domestic economic crash that has spurred the exodus of over 4.8 million Venezuelans, Maduro has not budged. Opposition and U.S. predictions that the armed forces would defect from the government under external pressure have proven false. And that's quite interesting. Didn't we just hear a couple weeks ago that it might be a matter of who the military sided with in Venezuela? Well, they've already played that game too, and the military has sided with Maduro. So Maduro has the presidency, the Congress, their National Assembly, nearly all their institutions, and the military, and he refuses to budge in negotiations, and they are still trying to get him to step down as though that is some realistic possibility. And because he won't do that, then they try to portray him as the loser of elections to the rest of the world. It's incredible, isn't it? As Chavismo's position strengthened its bid to dislodge Guaido from his formal post as National Assembly chair, and thus his claim to the interim presidency, climaxed on 5 January when the government placed a military and para-police cordon around the parliament and staged a highly dubious vote to change the leadership. The opposition is now embroiled in a fierce internal debate over whether to take part in parliamentary elections later this year, even in the absence of conditions for fair polls. So the writers of this report at the International Crisis Group are saying that the vote the government of Venezuela took was the staging of a highly dubious vote, and they protected the parliament with military and para-police, which should make you understand that the government violently took itself over. Yet if the government and Chavismo in general now feel more sanguine after weathering the storm of 2019, they hardly have reason to be at ease. The government's room for maneuver, both political and economic, is severely restricted by sanctions. It is regarded as illegitimate by dozens of countries. They're like trying to bully Venezuela. It faces constant efforts, both open and covert, to oust it from power. And even within its own ranks, there are rumblings of discontent over its increasingly authoritarian demeanor. You will notice that this is exactly how they sound about Donald Trump. Increasingly authoritarian demeanor, talking about how people within his own ranks prove there are rumblings of discontent. The whole thing is about to topple over. No, it's not. It has achieved undeniable tactical victories, but it has left the core of the problem unaddressed. If it intends to bring back political normalcy and stability, something needs to change. And so that is the assertion that they will continue to wage economic warfare and destabilize Venezuela to whatever extent they can until Maduro gives in. Until that time, there will not be political normalcy and stability. And again, this is a globalist think tank just declaring this. They are deciding how things are going to go in Venezuela. Who elected these people to chart the future course for Venezuela? No Venezuelan voted for these people. They haven't been elected by anyone. They're just global elites. They need Venezuela and its resources as part of the plan they've laid out. They are not going to change their plan. They have to make it work no matter what. And they will use financial and economic manipulation. They will use full control over propaganda and censorship. And they will attempt to use military force if they can. For some reason, they just can't, though. Isn't that strange? They just can't get the U.S. military to go down there and take over Venezuela. And it's at times like this that you have to remember they never thought Hillary Clinton was going to lose. What would have happened in a country like Venezuela when they declare someone else the president and then choose to go back it up with the force provided by the U.S. military? Would Hillary Clinton have gone along with that? Was that the original plan for Venezuela in 2018 and 2019? I guess we'll never know. The most promising effort to date at brokering a negotiated solution has been a series of talks between the two sides, facilitated by the Norwegian government between May and August 2019. But these have broken down. A victim of these headwinds, half-hearted engagement by both sides, and in particular, government obduracy. Prospects for their resumption are now dim. As described in a previous report, after 7 rounds of talks, most recently in Barbados, the government walked away in the wake of newly imposed U.S. sanctions, and the opposition pronounced the format exhausted on 15 September 2019. The talks had produced some movement. Shortly before they were suspended, the opposition had proposed that power pass temporarily to a ruling council, whose members would be appointed by mutual agreement. The Maduro government did not explicitly reject this latter proposal and offered to improve electoral conditions, but its negotiators said the president would not quit and that early elections would be possible only 1 year after the U.S. and others lift sanctions. Its seizure of parliament clearly suggests that at the highest levels of power, willingness to strike a deal is negligible. And so Maduro essentially kicked out The representatives of the global regime in Venezuela, the people referred to as the opposition in this report, he removed them from the Congress. And the position here is basically, until U.S. sanctions are lifted and a year has passed, there will be no discussion of early elections. Those are the conditions. If you want your early elections, end the sanctions, and then prove over time that you're not going to re-implement them. And the report makes clear that sanctions are not going to be lifted because they believe that's their leverage, no matter how much it harms the people of Venezuela. As crisis groups' discussions with more pragmatic Chavista and opposition figures suggest, however, the outlines of a potential compromise exist. This report spells it out in the hope that it will encourage future discussion. Neither side will find it fully satisfactory. Indeed, both will inescapably recoil at several of its elements. But its terms reflect crisis groups' best assessment of what the two sides might eventually be able to accept as fair and realistic. The first step on the ladder involves moves toward reducing tensions between the two sides and building mutual confidence. And I find it amusing whenever I'm reading these things, how clear it is that these people will not take no for an answer, despite no being the only answer they will ever get. It's like they're trying to get a date with Maduro and he keeps turning them down and unwilling to accept no as an answer. They just get continually creepier. And remember, again, we're 4.5 years on and the situation really hasn't changed. But let's continue. Should progress be made on that front, a political agreement would rest on 3 building blocks: steps to level the playing field for parliamentary and then presidential polls, incremental sanctions relief as political progress is made, and legally enshrined guarantees that can mitigate the fears of the eventual losing side in new balloting. They're basically saying, agree to our election system. We promise that after we steal the election, we won't round all of you up and put you in torture chambers. And of course, they will do that, but they're negotiating not doing that. The report also offers suggestions on how to resolve key disputes. The first is over the timing of a new presidential election and whether Maduro would need to step down beforehand. Second is the timing of sanctions relief and whether any should be provided while Maduro remains in power. A third issue, the military's future role, has been largely unaddressed by both sides, but is critical given the army's ties to Chavismo and the ability to sabotage any agreement of which it disapproves. Foreign powers and multilateral bodies that recognize the dangers of worsening conflict in Venezuela and are pushing for a negotiated settlement, notably the EU, the UN, and Latin American states such as Mexico and Argentina, should have the greatest interest in finding a negotiated way out of this crisis, coming up with or backing a similar proposal and pushing the parties to accept it as a basis for negotiations. The UN could also play an essential role in assisting and monitoring the implementation of an eventual political settlement. Really? Is that what the UN is there for? To assist in monitoring and implementing a settlement reached between global elites who want to seize power for that country on behalf of energy companies and the government of that country. What part of this is democratic? What part of this is our democracy? In the event that Caracas proves intransigent, the EU and Latin American allies should consider stepping up measures targeted at human rights violators and strengthen efforts to clamp down on international financial crimes committed by government officials. How about that? Those are points of leverage. If the government doesn't go along with the regime's plans, they are going to prosecute government officials for international financial crimes and accuse people of human rights violations. If those things are happening, why aren't they already addressing those things? It's amazing, isn't it? All the talk of equal justice under the law, it's all just nonsense. They love when people break the law because that actually gives them leverage over those people Although the truth is they don't even need that. The propaganda media will take care of that for them. It'll already try and convict people in the court of public opinion. And that gives them all the leverage they need to bend people to their will. Let's continue. Even those countries firmly opposed to Maduro, such as the U.S. and Colombia, or allied to his government, including Russia and Cuba, should discern the huge benefits for regional stability of supporting a route to a negotiated settlement. So they're making the case that it is in everyone's best interest to help them overthrow the government of Venezuela. The solutions proposed are not the only possibilities, nor even necessarily the best options available. They are intended to spur debate within Chavista and opposition ranks, but also among their respective foreign allies and other international stakeholders about the costs of and alternatives to the current deadlock. The unfortunate truth is that those alternative scenarios, Maduro's ouster by the military, foreign intervention to topple the government, or the government's survival despite dire economic conditions while the opposition subsides or its leaders retreat into exile, are either unlikely to occur or unlikely to restore the stability and improve Venezuelans' well-being. Distant as it now seems from the embittered politics and portents of violence in Caracas, an agreement remains the one sure way to prevent greater calamity from befalling both sides. Now, again, it's placed in these objective terms as if the members of the International Crisis Group, which honestly makes them sound like a group of retarded globalist superheroes, are just trying to help both sides reach some sort of compromise or resolution. But they're in full support of the quote-unquote opposition. In fact, they've probably created the opposition. They do it in countries all over the world. We talked at length about Alexei Navalny. That is clearly a creation of exactly these types of people, if not these actual people. I was doing research for my show Hindsight 2020, where we cover the news of the current week, but from back in 2020. And it turns out this past week saw the same sort of situation in Belarus, where they attempted to overthrow Lukashenko with the wife of a famous YouTuber who had been barred from politics. An almost exact parallel to Alexei Navalny and his wife, Yulia Navalnaya. They are creating and then propping up the political opposition in order to overthrow sovereign nations. And of course, they've done it here. People think countries like Venezuela are a mess, and to some extent, I suppose they are. But we're the country that's been fully infiltrated and actually have the quote-unquote opposition, the servants of these globalists, all throughout what is at least shown to us to be our government. Although, again, if there are many nations around the world that have a government recognized by the people, the institutions, and the military of that country, and another government who is recognized, at least in optical terms, by the global regime and the allies, only one of those is the actual government. Now, I think this report is absolutely fascinating, but it's over 30 pages long, and I'm not going to be able to go through all of it on the podcast. I do want to share some other highlights, though. So the report is called Imagining a Resolution of Venezuela's Crisis. We just went through the executive summary. Here's the first sentence of the introduction. The political struggle that for over 20 years has pitted Venezuela's Chavista government against an opposition spanning the political spectrum is now a ferocious battle for power, popularity, and international support against a backdrop of mass socioeconomic misery. A couple paragraphs later, they write, the Maduro government, adept at circumventing sanctions and outwitting the opposition, immediately announced that it had reached a settlement with a handful of minority opposition parties and set about preparing for legislative elections scheduled for late 2020. The opposition and its regional allies, led by the U.S. and Colombia, invoked a regional defense treaty that theoretically could pave the way for military action, though this option seems remote. And that's a bit shocking. Maduro reached an agreement with opposition parties to hold legislative elections. They are accusing Maduro of taking over the legislature by kicking out the global regime elements, Guaido's faction. They call him a brutal socialist dictator, a communist dictator, an authoritarian, an autocrat, all of those things. He's negotiating with opposition parties to hold elections. And again, I think it's best to consider this in parallel so that we can really understand what this looks like if what was happening there is happening here. And it turns out it kind of is. Let's say Donald Trump gets back in office, drains the swamp, removes the deep state, tears down the administrative state, kicks the global regime out of the United States of America, seizing back in one fell swoop control over our institutions, control over our government, and control over our currency and our economy. All of this as a product of widespread disclosure and exposure. Everyone understands what's been done, what has been done to us, what has been done in our name by this uniparty faction of the global regime. No one wants anything to do with that anymore. Donald Trump and whoever his successor is and whoever succeeds that person, all of them realize that the country does not want to go back to that level of global regime control. In fact, they don't want any of those globalists anywhere near the instruments and levers of power ever again. Now, they would absolutely be called brutal dictators presiding over a one-party government. Our situation would be broadcast to the world as one of total illegitimacy, where the government is actually oppressing the people, even if 90% of the people supported it. Now, however well things might go, however popular Donald Trump might become or his successors might become, assuming we still have relatively the same form of government, there will be disagreements among the people about how government should work and what its priorities should be. And there will be all sorts of even good faith opposition to any given agenda down the road. So think about what it would look like if a portion of the so-called opposition, that portion created and propped up by this global regime, something that exists basically only for optics and to provide puppets and Manchurian candidates, let's say they were barred from the political process in the country, but there was plenty of space for all of these other opposition viewpoints and parties or candidates or what have you. Is that a situation where we have legitimate elections and the opposition is allowed to participate? Or does it only count as allowing the opposition to participate if that opposition is the opposition created and directed by this same global regime? It's an important question that deserves significant thought because I think we'll probably confront that situation in the future. They go on to write, prospects for negotiated settlement appear more distant than ever. But does that stop them from pushing for it? No, it doesn't. If the International Crisis Group was trying to get a date, the woman at this point would be calling the police to complain about how the stalker is back outside her window. They write a few sentences later, for over 40 years, from 1958 to 1999, the peaceful transfer of power from government to opposition was an established practice, while Chavismo, the movement created by the late President Chavez, won 16 and lost 2 elections from 1998 to 2015 with no compelling evidence that it committed fraud. So it used to be extremely popular, and now it's extremely unpopular. In fact, the opposition received like 80% of the vote, according to the internet. In the next section, called A Thaw Between the Sides, they write, sorely needed confidence-building gestures from the government side appear increasingly unrealistic, leaving the opposition with the tough choice of whether to take part in parliamentary elections that seem bound to be rigged. So the opposition won't participate in the elections because the elections are not going to be held on the terms requested by these globalists who run that opposition. They are Venezuelan election deniers. They are threatening to tear down Venezuela's democracy. They don't want to participate in the elections they keep demanding because the elections will not be held under the terms they accept. But if I call or we call our elections here into doubt with the understanding that there is no way they will be legitimate, we are called terrorists. And by the way, why doesn't the opposition want to participate? Well, I can tell you why they wouldn't do that here if we had legitimate elections where we were certain that the outcome would be transparent and verifiable. The opposition wouldn't participate because their participation would prove to the country that they carry 15 to 20% support, 25% support? It's not anywhere near 50. And if it's not anywhere near 50, it's not just going to be about this election. It's going to cause people to look back and think, has it always been like this? And it turns out that, yeah, it's been like this for a long time. The fake elections, the fake polls have convinced us that we are something other than we are. They've convinced us that we and the people around us believe differently than we do. Our political situation in this country is totally unmoored from reality prime. There's virtually no connection there at all. Back to the report. They have a section on the history of mistrust between the two sides. Each side profoundly distrusts the other. The opposition is convinced that the government simply will not acquiesce to genuinely competitive elections that offer a real, fair chance for a transition. The government and its allies are persuaded that the opposition and its foreign partners want to erase Chavismo from the political map and turn back the clock to the days of oligarchy in Venezuela. Yeah, why would they think that? Is it just because global elites and energy companies are trying to use whatever influence and capital they can muster to overthrow the government and then install their own government friendly to them? Is that what makes them think it's going to be a return to oligarchy? Where did they come up with such an obviously correct idea? Skipping ahead once again in the same section. If the government wishes to patch up relations with the opposition without imperiling its authority, it could start by releasing political prisoners, estimated in mid-February to number 351, as well as restoring parliamentary immunity for around 30 opposition legislators, many in exile. At present, however, the government is stepping up, rather than scaling back, its resort to security forces, para-police units, including the colectivos, and judiciary to intimidate the opposition into silence. And again, this is the sort of squealing we'll hear from and about the uniparty figures when we reach any phase of accountability here in the United States. The report again mentions the opposition parties and the agreement they reached with Maduro, writing the mainstream opposition dismissed the agreement with minority parties as a sham and the parties themselves as a quote-unquote fake opposition, while remaining skeptical of the true intent behind the return to parliament. So let's say, for instance, that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., rather than just running as an independent, had started his own party under the idea that he was the perfect guy to bring together disillusioned Republicans and Democrats, and he called it like the Unity Party or something. What we're reading about Venezuela would be the equivalent of the Democrats and Republicans getting together to declare that Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Unity Party was a fake opposition party. They're definitely not MAGA, but they're also not the mainstream opposition that's propped up by the globalists. And because they're not interested in serving the globalists' aims in implementing their agenda, then they're considered fake opposition. They don't count in this situation because if they counted, then it would be impossible to paint Maduro as leading this one-party state. It would be hard to call him a dictator. And so they just pretend none of it's happening. The next section is called Ensuring a Level Playing Field, because that's the sort of thing that outside international global governing bodies are allowed to do in countries around the world that might not choose to elect the right people on their own. They write in the report, the opposition has raised increasingly credible concerns about the electoral system's integrity over the past 3 years. Along with international observers such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, it has decried partisan political control of the electoral system, use of the judiciary to persecute opposition politicians, and vote rigging at the ballot counting stage. Any resolution of Venezuela's crisis, therefore, will require significant improvements in electoral conditions, starting with the build-up to forthcoming parliamentary elections and extending to an array of reforms. And they have an entire segment of this report devoted to explaining what Venezuela needs to do in order to hold elections that they will approve of. They write, under the current circumstances, the opposition faces the difficult decision of whether or not to participate. The issue is proving deeply divisive. A substantial part of the opposition is inclined to boycott polls they fear will only benefit the government and provide it with cosmetic democratic credentials. So they don't want to participate in elections because the Maduro government would prove through those elections to have the popular support of the people. They go on. The more hardline among them hold that Guaido's interim presidency should organize parallel elections to demonstrate the weight of public opinion against Maduro. So Guaido, who did not run for president and who at this point is no longer even legitimately in the Congress, is still considered interim president by these people and some allied governments, including the United States. They should organize their own elections in order to prove to the people they're actually popular. They are legitimately suggesting fake elections for the optics. They list some of their demands. These might include establishment of a new consensual CNE. This is the National Electoral Council. Participation of mainstream opposition parties. Again, the other opposition parties are unacceptable. You have to have this mainstream opposition. Freedom to campaign across the country. The physical safety and freedom from judicial prosecution of opposition candidates, and the right of opposition activists to help monitor the vote count. So this parallel would basically be like understanding that Stacey Abrams was involved in stealing elections in Georgia and then refusing to prosecute Stacey Abrams and then allowing BLM Antifa to monitor the vote. They go on. Without these conditions in place, it is hard to imagine how any part of the Guaido-led opposition would participate. Indeed, the bulk of the opposition would boycott an election without those guarantees, leading to an illegitimate parliament, a continued political crisis with no foreseeable prospect of negotiations, and, most likely, tougher sanctions. Europe and other international stakeholders supportive of a peaceful settlement should focus their immediate efforts on pushing the government to meet the above conditions for parliamentary elections. They should then insist on an international mission to monitor these polls. It's like the Stalker is just recruiting all of his friends to hide in the bushes all around Nicolas Maduro's apartment. The boombox thing didn't work. The flowers at the doorstep didn't work. The Valentine's chocolates sent to Maduro's office didn't work. So now it's just the Stalker and his friends outside the apartment 24 hours a day, working in shifts. They go on. The opposition might even agree to the return of government-appointed diplomats to posts in countries that recognize Guaido as president, which in certain cases, such as the U.S., Argentina, Colombia, and Peru, they had to leave when opposition-appointed envoys took their place. Opposition leaders could urge these countries to consent to the establishment of embassies staffed by representatives of both sides, with the understanding that this measure would facilitate an agreement. So they're offering for members of Maduro's government, for diplomats from Venezuela, to conduct their foreign affairs with the nations allied to the regime, who've now been cut off. Again, they're basically bullying Maduro, going around to all of the mutual friends and saying, if you're going to be friends with Maduro, you're not allowed to be friends with us. You need to choose sides right now. And there really is a reason that the child brain thing is so accurate for these people. They have not matured. They use high school tactics to get their way constantly. They act like spoiled, emotional teenagers, and perhaps not even teenagers. They write, in parallel, And as an incentive, the EU could offer the prospect of improving diplomatic ties and pressing the case for Venezuela's return to international financial markets if progress is made toward a fair vote. Again, they promise to slightly reduce the suffering of the Venezuelan people that they have inflicted if Nicolas Maduro makes it easier for the global regime to overthrow his country. Now, this part is particularly amusing because we know how upset they are with the current state of Venezuela's National Electoral Council. This section is called a new National Electoral Council. The global regime wants to change over the membership of the body that oversees elections in Venezuela. And they want to do this in order to guarantee themselves a quote unquote fair election. Here's how that section starts off. As seen, the CNE's fate is central to any political resolution. The 5-person CNE board, whose members the Constitution mandates, are to be chosen by the National Assembly, presently splits 4-1 in the government's favor. Under today's circumstances, reform presents a problem. Member selection requires a 2/3 parliamentary vote, but the government has successfully maneuvered to deprive the opposition of the necessary votes. Accordingly, some form of agreement is needed between the opposition and the government. So the system that is set up to allow for fair representation is not producing representation that's acceptable to the global regime. So they're saying that the government must grant them some sort of concessions in an agreement to change over the electoral board that will oversee the early elections they want the government to agree to hold, even though the government doesn't have to do any of these things and will not do any of these things. They write, if both sides were to acquiesce to an even division of representatives on the board, with opposition and pro-government deputies each selecting 2 CNE board members, while a chairperson would be chosen by mutual agreement, they would be taking an important step toward a credible parliamentary election later this year. So the situation is they are outnumbered 4-1. And what they're proposing is to split evenly 2-2, 4 of the board seats, and then have another person in there who's agreed upon by both sides. What they are asking, legitimately what they are asking, is for Nicolas Maduro to agree from going 4-1 in his favor to 3-2 in their favor, just as, I guess, a sign of good faith. Again, this is insane. A credible vote, in turn, would facilitate participation of most of the opposition, increase the likelihood of a representative turnout of voters, and provide the Maduro government with a strong claim that Venezuela remains a functioning democracy, as if that is the number one priority for Nicolas Maduro. Now, again, I don't know Nicolas Maduro. He might be a great guy. He might be a terrible guy. But if he is standing up to these people, steadfast on behalf of the Venezuelan people, in the face of all this, it is highly doubtful that he cares whether or not these people consider Venezuela to be a functioning democracy. And he probably doesn't care a whole lot about how the regime's propaganda media around the world talks about him. He's got Putin and Xi and others. He's got the BRICS nations. Venezuela will very likely be joining that BRICS contingent. They're already selling their oil in currencies outside of the global regime's fiat currency, currently branded as the American dollar. And they're taking back part of the global regime's proxy state in Guyana. They close that section writing, without progress in this direction, the opposition will continue to reject the election results and the government's legitimacy. And countries that support Guaido will almost certainly maintain and perhaps intensify their campaign to isolate and squeeze Maduro and his allies. Again, 4.5 years ago, it hasn't worked. The next section is called Electoral Register, and this part is incredible. The Venezuelan Electoral Register has not been properly updated in recent years, as a result of which as many as 2 million people of voting age may have been excluded. Moreover, at least 4 million have left the country since 2015, and their participation is hindered by the absence of consular facilities. a consequence of the country's financial crisis, the replacement of government-appointed diplomats by Guaido's appointees, obstruction by Maduro's consular officials, and the Venezuelan government requirement that voters be legal residents of the country in which they vote. So the Venezuelan government requiring that Venezuelans live in Venezuela if they want to vote in Venezuelan elections is an impediment in the eyes of the International Crisis Group. They're concerned that Venezuela has made it hard for the people who have left Venezuela to vote in Venezuelan elections. And that's kind of incredible because they're also working for those very same people to be allowed to vote in American elections. But let's continue. The government, suspecting that most voters residing abroad support the opposition, will resist incorporating them into the register. A possible compromise would be to give voters abroad a specific, time-limited period to register, ensuring that consulates are staffed by officials appointed by both government and opposition, notably in Colombia, where over 1.8 million Venezuelans now reside, would be important to enhance the resulting register's credibility. They want votes from wherever they can get them, and they are willing to use leverage over the native government to force them to allow votes to come in from all over the world. And again, that sounds just like how it goes here. Regarding the polling stations and the system's audit, the more critical step would be a professional audit by an independent body of the electronic voting system in the presence of political party representatives. How about that? They want the voting machines audited. Now, what voting machines are those? Are they the Smartmatic voting machines in Venezuela? Or are they some other brand that runs the exact same system? And remember, Mark Malloch Brown is the chairman of the board of trustees. They go on. The opposition's refusal to take part in recent elections, coupled with the 2018 withdrawal of the company that provided the technological platform for polls, means the system has not been audited in years. How very sad. In the footnote on the very same page, they write, during the vote count for the 2017 Constituent Assembly election, technical experts from Smartmatic, whose electronic voting system was employed, left the country after detecting irregularities. The company later said turnout figures had been artificially boosted by at least 1 million votes. On March 6, 2018, Smartmatic announced that it was withdrawing from Venezuela and could, quote, not guarantee the integrity, end quote, of recent elections. They even note that Mark Malloch Brown is part of the International Crisis Group and the holding company for Smartmatic. What follows is a large section about whether or not Maduro could be convinced to step down before the elections, handing power over to either Guaido or some independent interim government that would then make sure their elections went just fine. They write, the government officially rejects the idea of Maduro stepping down prior to elections and, as mentioned above, remains lukewarm at best toward the notion of calling early presidential polls. The farthest some of the more pragmatic Chavistas have come is to contemplate a political agreement pursuant to which Maduro would resign, thereby triggering fresh elections in which he could compete within 30 days as per the Constitution, and only a full year after sanctions are lifted. It is hard at this stage to see them agreeing to a significantly longer period for an interim government before new polls. Skipping ahead once more to the section on sanctions relief. The Maduro government argued that elections held while sanctions remain in place would give the opposition an unfair advantage. And of course that's true. The opposition's argument is that the Maduro government has led Venezuela into economic devastation. If the sanctions were lifted and a year passed after the lifting of those sanctions, the economic devastation would end, and the opposition would no longer have their best argument against the Maduro government, which is why they would never agree to Maduro's terms, and Maduro would never agree to their terms. The government cited the imposition of additional U.S. sanctions last August, just prior to a new round of the Barbados talks, as proof that the opposition had no authority over the application or the lifting of these measures, questioning the utility of discussions with opposition political forces that were unable to influence a matter of critical importance to Chavistas. So basically, they're created and propped up opposition, in quotes, and the globalists controlling that opposition would be totally unable to lift the sanctions on their own, and they weren't going to convince anyone else to do so either. They don't have any say in that process, so why would the Maduro government even consider those elements as leverage from the opposition in negotiations? They'd be accepting a promise that the opposition isn't even in position to make. There's a discussion of various forms of sanctions. They then write, these financial sanctions have had considerable impact, not only starving the government of cash, but also prompting over-compliance by nervous foreign banks and financial services companies. And it's interesting to frame their activity as over-compliance and their mood as nervous when it's these same people at the International Crisis Group that are aligned with these foreign banks. HSBC is one of their corporate partners. They go on. The Trump administration compounded this problem with its 5 August announcement of a ban on all financial and commercial transactions involving Venezuelan government officials. So wait a second. The Trump administration in January of 2019 at the State of the Union, Donald Trump himself voiced his support for Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. He accepted the opposition's claims. And yet, what he did following that didn't seem to appease these people at all. In fact, it may have made the situation even worse. They write, over time, the government has found ways to cushion its principal constituency from the effects of sanctions, raising further questions about their efficacy in producing a solution. And again, if you think about that in parallel, that would be like saying Trump has made sure that these sanctions aren't destroying the people who make up his base, but the sanctions are destroying some people, and those people help us present to the world the picture that this country is being economically devastated by their brutal authoritarian dictator. They write, today, Caracas, which is less affected by power cuts and fuel shortages than the rest of the country, presents a facade of apparent normality for those who do not venture outside the middle-class enclaves. For the vast majority of Venezuelans, however, daily life is a struggle for survival. So things in the capital city are fine, but the devastation is elsewhere? That sounds like Ukraine, where Kyiv has been just fine the entire time. People have been shopping. They've been going to concerts and festivals. They've been partying at bars and nightclubs. It's like the global propaganda media is just lying to us about foreign countries. They continue. Sanctions are a blunt instrument that, in Venezuela as elsewhere, tend to harm those they are intended to help far more than those they are meant to hurt. Their precise impact on ordinary Venezuelans is hard to assess, but by reducing the country's export revenue and hence import capacity, they have contributed to the hyperinflationary spiral and the impoverishment of the population. Their political effectiveness is also a matter of intense debate, but at a minimum, their utility depends on their being tied to an identifiable, realistic objective. In this respect, the Trump administration's position that no sanctions relief will be available until Maduro steps down and that he must leave office significantly prior to new elections being held is increasingly detached from realities on the ground. So they implemented these crippling sanctions against Venezuela, hoping to eventually get U.S. military force to back this regime change down in Venezuela. But instead of having Hillary Clinton in that position as president of the United States, they ended up with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump did what they asked. He recognized Guaido as the leader. He kept those sanctions in place. He said those sanctions will remain in place until Maduro steps down. Maduro has never stepped down. Guaido has never functioned as the president. So Donald Trump did what they asked, but not everything they asked, and nothing actually changed on the ground. They didn't get the outcome they were seeking, and they looked like the bad guys in the end. But let's read that sentence on sanctions again. Sanctions are a blunt instrument that, in Venezuela as elsewhere, tend to harm those they are intended to help far more than those they are meant to hurt. So they don't work. They know they don't work because their counterparty is not going to say yes no matter what they do. And at this point, their counterparties are leaving that financial system behind in toto. And all that remains is the global regime waging economic warfare against the people of the country, hoping to increase their suffering to such an extreme level that the country will decide to overthrow its own government just to ease this suffering. And not only is it not working, Maduro's government is getting better at shielding the people of Venezuela from the impact of those foreign sanctions. Toward the end of the section on sanctions, they write the last sanctions, as well as targeted individual sanctions from regional neighbors and the EU, should be lifted completely once a free and fair presidential election has been held and its results respected. Lifting sanctions on a country struggling to consolidate a political settlement or making the transition to a new government while simultaneously addressing a grave economic and humanitarian crisis is risky. Venezuela could well be besieged by creditors seeking to recover a debt it cannot repay. So they have caused the problem. They have promised to potentially ease the suffering, but are also concerned that the problem might present itself even after they've held up their end of the bargain. And the section concludes this way. Any such move would therefore optimally be preceded by a UN Security Council resolution similar to that which protected Iraq's assets from its creditors after the U.S. invasion toppling Saddam Hussein. Moreover, lifting financial sanctions, while a necessary step, does not, in and of itself, guarantee economic recovery. Investors will be looking for clear signals that any agreement is sustainable and that the new government is market friendly. So basically, they want all of these concessions in order for them to lift sanctions. And at that point, there will be early elections called, held under their terms. And then after that, there will be a period where they monitor just to make sure everything remains stable with their new system put in place. And then at that point, there might be a return of these global investors. At what point is this only malicious harassment and coercion? They then move to a section called longer-term guarantees and write, in short, a stable transition requires a series of guarantees that would prevent the perpetuation of a winner-takes-all system and protect political rights of the losing side. Given the opposition's current prospects of victory, assurance to Chavismo that its interests will be respected regardless of the electoral outcome will be particularly important. So they basically assume that the opposition is definitely going to win by so much. So what they need to do is give some assurances to the Chavismo side. We're going to hold elections under our terms. We're going to ensure ourselves the outcome, but then we'll be nice to you afterward. This is the sort of guarantee that we can make. They propose constitutional amendments, writing a possible alternative would be to permit a president to seek a maximum 2 consecutive terms or to stand for a second term only after having first left office. The 1961 Venezuelan Constitution stipulated as much. Finally, reintroducing an upper chamber to the National Assembly with powers that include the ratification of appointments to the upper ranks of the armed forces would also help balance presidential powers and restore regional rights. So they want to be able to control, through the representatives they install in the government, who fills the upper ranks of the military, so that they can make sure the military won't align with the Maduro regime, with Chavismo, and will instead be friendly to these global interests. They bring up the need for truth commissions. There have been various attempts to set up truth commissions to deal with political violence and human rights violations in the Chavista era. The first effort was the 2003 agreement brokered by the OAS, the UN, and the Carter Center following the 2002 coup attempt against Chavez and the subsequent strike and lockout of 2002 and 2003. So they basically want a retroactive propaganda effort where they can frame the Chavez-Maduro government as having committed a whole range of atrocities that will then help them sell the notion that there is no way the Venezuelan people would ever vote Chavismo back into power upon discovering all of these awful atrocities they've committed. They discussed the role of the military, writing the military's potential to sabotage any interim arrangements, thwart a new government, or fail to address the spread of non-state armed groups across Venezuela mean that its cooperation and consent are vital for any workable control. So they need to figure out a way to bring the military under their control, the military that supports Chavismo. Under socioeconomic policies, they write that the Chavistas are concerned that an opposition-led administration would swiftly move to undo their achievements and, in their eyes, revert to a system tilted toward Venezuela's traditional business elites and members of the upper class, leaving the poorest to fend for themselves and opening the country to exploitation by foreign corporations. To reassure them, a political agreement between government and opposition might incorporate provisions acceptable to both sides, in line with previous constitutional articles that future governments would be expected to honor. Examples of such provisions include a guarantee of public ownership of hydrocarbon and other natural resources in the subsoil, guaranteed access to public health, education, and housing, and subsidies covering essentials such as food and medicines to shield the most vulnerable from the impact of adjustment measures. They're talking about removing a socialist dictator, in their terms, and now a communist dictator because he's been promoted based on Maduro being very, very mean, and what they want to do to assure the Venezuelan people that they will not just return to oligarchic rule by foreign interests is provide public health, housing, education, food, and medicines, and quote-unquote public ownership of their major industries, particularly their oil industry, at least however much remains after the foreign corporations and people like Mark Malloch Brown and George Soros get their share. I mean, they're the ones setting up the whole plan. They're not going to go to all that effort and do all that work unless their beak gets wet too. And of course, they demand a new UN presence. So let's just hit the conclusion here. Even amid Venezuela's catastrophic contest for power, a route to a compromise solution remains possible. It will require flexibility on the part of both sides, as well as on Washington's, to take it. As witnessed by Crisis Group, pragmatic Chavistas and opposition members have repeatedly discussed elements of a negotiated outcome during private encounters. And it's worth mentioning, by the way, every time I see this phrase, pragmatic Chavistas, it makes me think of establishment Republicans, rhinos, fake MAGA, people who pretend to be MAGA friendly but don't actually have America First interests in mind at all. The mainstream pretends that all of those people somehow hold some kind of sway within MAGA. They're the rational ones, the pragmatic ones. Maybe a deal can be reached with them and they can sell it to MAGA. But no, there's no deals. And it doesn't sound like there are any deals in Venezuela either. Some elements are recognized by both as essential. Others are far more controversial with one group or the other. But neither side can achieve all that it desires. And at this point, the price paid by Venezuela and its people, regardless of whether they are Chavistas or opposition sympathizers, for maintaining the status quo far exceeds the price either would pay as a result of pragmatic, principled compromise. So you see, they just have to do what's demanded of them, or else their suffering will continue. The primary obstacles to a deal are familiar. On one side is the unwillingness of senior government officials to submit to an early competitive presidential election when they claim to see no fault in the 2018 poll and pin all blame on a U.S.-led campaign of regime change. And they probably pin all the blame on that because that's exactly what's happened. And that's exactly what's described in this report. This report describes an ongoing campaign for regime change. This is an internationally led coup against the government of Venezuela. On the other are the opposition's doubts as to whether they could ever trust a government they regard as venal, autocratic, and so bent on staying in power that it has manipulated the electoral system to its advantage. As for the U.S., it has focused primarily on exercising pressure, mainly in the form of sanctions, as a way of compelling Maduro's ouster. If no progress is made toward resolution, Venezuela runs the risk of ending this year with parliamentary elections boycotted by the bulk of the opposition. All institutions in government hands, a heightened political crisis, tougher sanctions, and greater economic misery for the vast majority of the population. This report offers one possible road to agreement. It rests on several pillars: restoration of a modicum of trust through reciprocal gestures, creation of conditions for fairer, more equitable elections, first ahead of parliamentary polls later this year, and then more profound changes prior to a presidential election, changes in the way power is distributed, and a readiness by the opposition and the U.S. to scale back sanctions as Chavismo takes these steps. Countries viewed as relatively neutral and with ties to the two sides could put this plan or a similar one forward to present a clear alternative to the status quo, generate broad debate, and extricate Venezuela from its ever-deepening crisis. And again, the crisis is caused by exactly these people. They want to create a modicum of trust through a series of reciprocal gestures, even though the Venezuelan people and Nicolas Maduro, I guess, don't seem to be threatening the global regime in any way. They just don't want anything to do with them. It's like they're claiming that they're justified in stalking this person for a date and getting all their friends to join in the stalking and harassment and coercion, and then acting like they're being attacked because the answer continues to be no. They're claiming to be the ones who are being hurt in this scenario, asking for concessions and reciprocal gestures when, again, the answer is only no. And this is just one example of the playbook. We don't need to infer any conspiracies or conspiracy theories. It's spelled out in black and white from the people attempting to direct the situation on behalf of global elite interests. They are telling us in no uncertain terms exactly what they want and exactly how they intend to get it. And apparently they are selling all of this nonsense to their friends and allies and business associates in hopes that all of them can get together and collude to overthrow the government of Venezuela. And they are more than happy to coerce the participation of all of their allies as well. They are saying in a top-down way, this is what we are going to do. These groups are totally unelected, and they take control of global governing bodies. They take control over transnational corporations, if not directly, then through other organizations like the World Economic Forum, and they coerce compliance and participation. They hold meetings with their counterparts to decide what is going to happen in the nations of the world. And that, my friends, is our democracy. And nothing about this is new or isolated. This is how it's been for a very long time. I've mentioned before that I'm reading a book by a man named Edwin Black, who is a Jewish Zionist. The book is called The Transfer Agreement. It is in its third edition, so it's a very popular book, a very well-regarded book, an award-winning book. It describes the negotiations and the deal made between the Zionists and the Nazis prior to World War II to move European Jews down to Palestine to settle the global regime proxy state of Israel. It is written in essentially the same voice that you read in this report. It goes into exacting detail over the discussions and negotiations between the various global governing bodies of what it refers to. This is not my phrase. It's directly from the book. The global governing bodies of international Jewry, figuring out how to use media and finance to affect the political outcomes they desire when making this deal with the Nazis. Global governing bodies around the world colluding to affect a particular political outcome and making a whole lot of money in the process. Not only is this not new over time, you can find this replicated over and over with various countries around the world on the International Crisis Group's website right now. This morning, I was looking at a similar report about Libya. And the very first paragraph of the report says this: Libya's political crisis took a new turn after its House of Representatives, based in the eastern city of Tobruk, approved a plan to appoint an interim government that would reunify the country's two parallel executives as part of a roadmap to general elections. House members made this decision with backing from representatives of the rival Tripoli-based Assembly, the High State Council, and from East-based military strongman Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar. If it garners sufficient support, the plan could be an important step toward healing the rift that has placed Libya under the split administration of two separate authorities for much of the past decade. But it still faces significant obstacles with influential critics both inside and outside Libya. So right there, they describe two separate governments, one recognized in the country by its people and the other recognized by the global bodies. In all of these cases, the decisions about who's going to run the country are made by people who not only imagine themselves to be well above the people of that country, who are meant to decide who leads them and who occupies their government of their representatives, they're also well above whoever those representatives might be. These decisions are clearly being made from the top and then implemented through whatever corruption, compromise, and coercion can be garnered in order to effect the regime change. All of it in service of that global agenda and its implementation. But they can't get it done. And they can't get the United States and its military to do what they have threatened to do. And again over the years, we have seen the global regime losing its grip on country after country, whether it's a small country like Myanmar or Burkina Faso, or far more prominent proxy states. These plans no longer seem to be working. And when you read them, they don't even sound serious. They are totally detached from reality. And I guess we'll see what happens here. But I'll leave you with this to think about. I've talked many times about how I believe Donald Trump is always mid-negotiation. He is always attempting to use his public communications as a means not only of narrative manipulation, but as a means of open public negotiation. He is constantly speaking his terms out loud and stating his threats out loud. And I believe he's often taunting them as well. But you can imagine he's in these sorts of negotiations. I think we can easily make the case that Donald Trump was granting them a concession when he recognized Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela in his State of the Union speech. That's something that was negotiated. He accepted that deal. We don't know what the other side of that deal was like, but they got something they wanted, and it made no difference. You can imagine there are many other examples of that. A strange appointment to a board, an endorsement that doesn't make sense. These are things that must be done in order to achieve concessions from the other side. And it's a process, a long process. Trump might know what he can give away without actually hurting his cause. And so he gives those things away. We all wonder what in the world he's doing, but that's what deal making is all about. The standard issue villagers out there, the people who continue to support the uniparty, the people who don't even understand there is a uniparty, they just think the president is like a king and he just puts in place whatever it is he wants over time, as if there aren't powerful interests in opposition 100% of the time, opposing everything he does. It is a constant negotiation between Trump and his allies and these people on the other end. Imagine what that must have looked like when Donald Trump stepped away in early 2021, or at least stepped slightly off stage for a while. That's a concession you can imagine people like this would have thought was pretty important. They probably thought they won at that point. Well, it doesn't look like it now. But that doesn't mean that Donald Trump and MAGA just get everything they want on the spot all the time forever. You give away things that you don't need, that don't change things from your perspective, in exchange for concessions from the other side that do. And you keep playing the game, making deals like that over time as the public sentiment comes around to back your position, so that ultimately the leverage ends up only on one side, and it is the other side granting constant concessions that actually matter, that weaken them and strengthen you. This is the process that we've seen playing out over the course of these last 9 years, and maybe longer, but very slowly and very frustratingly. But regardless, this is what's happening. This is how it works. And this is the real battle being fought. Donald Trump is not contesting Kamala Harris or the fake president, Joe Biden. These are the people with whom the deals are made. It is their election system in place right now that the American people are expecting to get relief from. And it's possible that the best Donald Trump can negotiate, or that anybody can negotiate, it's no fault of Trump's, would be to be named the winner of the presidential election. And a lot of people would celebrate quite a bit. But again, that's the regime's best outcome. Donald Trump being named president, you give us a few more rhinos in there, make everybody go back to sleep. The government is all uniparty, prepared to subvert everything Donald Trump and MAGA intend to accomplish while keeping their election system in place. And everybody in the country still continues to think that things are legitimate through and through. And if that's the case, we will still move forward, but understanding that that's not victory. That was a concession from the other side, and that we need to continue to increase the leverage regardless, because the game isn't over if these people are still making the decisions for us. All right, so tomorrow's live stream will be at 3 p.m. Eastern. I am traveling on Thursday for the Great American Restoration Tour in Deadwood, South Dakota. So I hope to see some of you there. You can purchase virtual tickets to watch online at badlandsmedia.tv/events. And then I will be at the conference on Friday. So live stream tomorrow for paid subscribers, 3 p.m. Eastern. And as far as this podcast goes, I will be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's